Okay, so we move on after the coffee break. I think a lot of people are still having the coffee, but I think they will come here in a couple of seconds because we move on with a very interesting speaker. So I'm very happy that I can welcome again here on the Digitale Leute stage, Tim Herbig. Please come on stage and a big applause for Tim. So, and I think Tim is one of our, from the very beginning of Digitale Leute, Tim was with us at the first Digitale Leute Summit. I think every year he did a full day workshop, and so he is really someone who makes his workshops always full. So his workshop tomorrow is also sold out, so you can't join. And yeah, Tim, I'm very happy that you're here again. I'm looking forward to your talk, how to connect the dots. I'm very interested in that. So the stage is yours, Tim Herbig.
Thanks, Stefan. Good afternoon, Cologne. Can you all hear me okay? Sound? Perfect. Thanks for confirming. I want us all to imagine something together to get going. I want us all to imagine, these are not the latest slides. These are not the slides that should be there. Yeah, it's the wrong slide deck. Funny.
So that never happened before.
Yeah, of course not. Like, could you check that you have the latest version of the slides on, maybe? I wish I were better at telling jokes to bridge the time, sit with the uncomfortable silence. Let's try to do the slide. Okay, let me do that. All right, so the thing I want you to memorize, to imagine, we're going to do that together, and hopefully the slides will lead the way later on. Let's imagine we all work at a company together. And the name of this company is Analytico. And Analytico is a B2B SaaS product. And as the name suggests, Analytico ships, perfect, thank you. Analytico ships analytics software, mostly for in-house marketing and product teams. And one day at Analytico, there's a company all hands. And in this all hands, there's an update to the product strategy the company wants to focus on. And the absolute synthesis of this product strategy articulation comes in the form of a statement, which says, our strategy to grow our revenue from agency customers is to be customer-centric, fast. Who here in this room, with a show of hands, would say that this is a strategy that helps you make decisions, to focus your work, to actually move forward with your priorities? Quick show of hands. Okay. I wouldn't be in this camp either, right? So full disclosure. So let me share with you one of my favorite ways to look at product strategies and their potential usefulness from a very simplistic way. But warning, once you've seen that, you probably can no longer unsee it. At least that's what happened for me. And this comes from one of my favorite thinkers on product strategy, Roger Martin, who basically says, look, if you look at your product strategy, and if the opposite is an obviously stupid idea, you're probably not making a real choice here, right? So again, and I can probably see in some of your heads that you're starting to reassess the strategy in your company and think about, well, what's the opposite of that strategy? Is that actually a really stupid idea? Are we not making any real choices here? So let's take that back to Analytico, and let's look at this strategy statement they have come up with. If you turn it in the opposite direction, it says, our strategy is to grow our revenue from agency customers by not being customer-centric and by being slow. Doesn't really look like an actual alternative to me. It looks like something that would be stupid on its face, that would not succeed with Roger Martin's stupidity test. Now, what can you do about it? A lot of teams that I get to meet then think about things like we basically have to try harder. We have to strategize harder. We have to read all the Substacks. We need to run more strategy workshops. We maybe just have to put it in a different template. Maybe a different canvas will help us here. We basically have to strategize harder. Maybe you don't. Maybe the team at Analytico also does not need to strategize harder. Because what I think is when you get too obsessed with trying to get a process right to make sure you're moving forward, is really that there's a path that leads to what I like to call alibi progress, where you obsess more about the correctness of your way of working over its actual value. What I want to do together with you in this talk is to talk about different ways of maybe flipping that around and prioritizing the value of a way of working over the technical correctness, so that you are more able to make real progress, and that this is true for the team at Analytico as well. So we're going to do that for the main takeaway from this talk, which is how you can really improve and make sure that practices like strategy, OKRs, and discovery are focused on actual value by thinking about how you can connect these dots. Instead of being very obsessed with the individual practices, with how to strategize better, better templates, better OKRs, and that kind of stuff, and how to connect these dots. That's the idea of the talk I want to share with you. Does that sound good? Okay, I see some nodding. That's enough for me. So we're going to do that by looking at the three practices I just talked to you about: product strategy, product OKRs, and product discovery, simply because these are the practices that are at the core of my everyday work. And we're going to get started with product strategy. And don't get me wrong, you don't have to make sure your product strategy is 100% bulletproof and waterproof and fully perfect before anybody starts to work on these. That's not what I mean. But I think there's an opposite of that end as well, where the strategy is just full of too many assumptions that have only been generated in workshops without real customer contact. And so I think there's an issue in that as well, because the more assumptuous the degree of your strategy is, the higher the chances of them not being decisive, because it's only made up, right? So how could you approach this? I think one way to do that is to actually get clear on what's the value of something like product strategy. Before you talk about the templates, the tactics, all the fancy stuff, well, what should it actually do for you? Like, try to think about strategy as a product for yourself. And your definition of that value might look different, and that's perfectly fine. I think one way of looking at the value of product strategy is to say that it needs to help teams and stakeholders to actually say yes or no to things, to opportunities. And maybe over a time horizon of, let's say, 6 to 18 months. Right? So if we have that value in mind, the question is, okay, how can we put that into practice? How can we improve the value of our product strategy? I think one thing that makes this so difficult, and to also arrive at something that meets Roger Martin's stupidity test, is that we look at strategy as this one big artifact. The one Miro board, the one PowerPoint deck, the one sentence, the one statement. And I think what can be really, really helpful is if you think about how can I break down my product strategy? What does it actually consist of? And I think if you look at a lot of different strategy articulations, you might find that it consists of a set of repetitive patterns. It probably has some articulation of an actual narrative. Like, why do we want to do that? Why do we want to act on this now? What are the overarching company goals? What's our North Star metric? Like, anything that helps you set up the narrative. Then you probably have something that articulates what's often called the playing field in strategy lingo, which basically tells you about, okay, for whom are we trying to do something, and who else might try to do that? Right? You could break that down as well. And then you maybe also talk about some of the things that actually help you on these playing fields. Like, what can you do to actually win here? Which means, what's the value I'm providing for this audience I'm choosing? What kind of differentiations do I have compared to the other people who try to serve the same job for people? And if you have these in place, you can then think about which individual components are needed in my company to shape these patterns, to fill them with life. Do you have a North Star metric? Then use that. Do you have a mission, a vision? Can you use these? What's the company strategy? What are the business goals? Whether you use jobs or problem statements or needs. You can use all these different tactics to then compose them together into your product strategy, but breaking them down into individual components makes it much easier to make them more decisive. Now, if we bring this back to Analytico, and we look at their statement, we have some kind of playing field articulation here, right? The company says, like, we want to focus on agencies. We want to shift from in-house teams to agencies, right? That's one articulation that they have. There's probably even some kind of narrative in here, which is we want to grow revenue. Might not be the most inspiring narrative, but it might just be the narrative for this company right now. But the issue is, so we have some kind of clarity on the target audience focus. But what we don't have is like a clear path of how we want to get to revenue. Right? We don't really know how we want to win because we already established that just to be customer-centric is probably not a helpful strategy choice that helps you say no to things. So we have this lack of clarity here. Right? So there's an obvious gap in Analytico's product strategy articulation. Now, what this leads to are conversations like this. If you have a strategy that is not as decisive, people could approach you and say, hey, you know what, we should actually make the free features worse. And all you can say is, yeah, I guess that would help with having people upgrade faster, but you're not really sure if this is a good idea. Or people coming to you with actual feature suggestions, which say, maybe we should just allow agencies to only use our tracking system and not connect to third-party sources. And again, all you can say is, well, maybe that is what they want. So you can already see that your strategy is not that decisive. It doesn't help you say yes or no if it has this big degree of assumption, so many assumptions in there and this lack of decisiveness. So what you can really boil things down to is, from the strategy statement, there's one big, hopefully obvious bit of uncertainty baked into it. And this bit of uncertainty is, well, what kind of problems can we as Analytico actually solve better than competitors' alternatives for analytics agencies in a specific way so that we get chosen? Right? So that's the elephant in the room. That's the part of uncertainty. That's part of the strategy that leads to their strategy not being very decisive, not really useful, frankly. If there would only be a part of product management that tries to reduce uncertainty, that would be so helpful. I think there is actually one. Because independent of all the tactics, all the design sprints, all the interviews, all the fancy stuff, going back to the value something like product discovery should provide for you is actually about reducing uncertainty as much as possible. Again, your definition might vary, but I think for a lot of companies, product discovery should come down to reducing uncertainty around the problems that are worth solving and the solutions that are actually worth building. A product manager I was once working with, she framed it even differently. Towards the companies, she said, product discovery is about protecting the company's investment. Same thing, different lens. Landed completely different with the important stakeholders. So we actually have practices in place, right? We have product discovery, and so I think it's worth taking a closer look at product discovery to think about, well, how can that dot, how can the second dot of product discovery help us to make real progress and fill some of these gaps and voids we have seen in the product strategy of Analytico? Now, when we look at product discovery, just like a common theme might be that your product strategy is too assumptuous, one of the most common themes I get when I meet teams in product discovery is that they have an idea, they have a pretty good idea of the different techniques and the methods, and they are well equipped, but they don't really know where to start. You could talk to all customers all day long and spend the rest of your life solving every customer's problem without making real progress. You're busy with discovery, but you're probably not making a difference. And that kind of state of leaving teams in this lack of guidance, lack of orientation bit, leads to something I like to call opportunistic discovery. Right? You're doing discovery, don't get me wrong, you're doing the methods, the techniques, you're talking to customers all day long, but really what you're doing is you solve all the problems, and your main justification for solving problems is, well, they exist, so we should solve them. And what this leads to is the state of saying to every customer and every persona and every segment, like, you get a solved problem, you get a solved problem, and everyone gets a solved problem. And you could argue that's better than giving everyone their wish features, but it's not that far off. It's not that far off. So ideally, the opposite would be we take what's good already, we take those discovery practices that really, really work well, and we apply them in a more targeted way. And so the opposite of opportunistic discovery would be simply to be more targeted. And targeting really means that you solve the problems for the audience that matters. And you solve the problems because you have a better justification than it's there. Somebody has told us they have an issue with that. And when I try to guide product teams towards more targeted product discovery, there are three different angles I try to encourage them to look at, to consider when they prioritize their work. So one thing is, how clear are they about the business goal? We talked about this. If you don't have a clear, like a narrowed path from the beginning, you don't have a good idea of what the actual strategic goal is, if you don't have a clear narrative, if you have no like first cornerstones as part of your product strategy, it's difficult to know which direction to run. Is it like monetization, activation, growth, satisfaction, process improvements? What is the issue, the overarching thing? So how clear can you be on that? And again, this is not so much a discovery issue, but more of an issue of all the adjacent processes that should enable you to do targeted discovery. Second thing we just talked about, like again, do you try to solve everyone's problem, and do you think you're a good product manager because you do regular interviews and write down all the problems and solve everyone's problems? I like to beg different. And this, of course, also continues in the solution space. Like just because you came up with a solution that works well and connects well to a proven problem, the question is, do you just show it to all the users, and do you treat all the feedback equal in your company? Or do you have a better idea of like, what kind of reaction, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, do I need to get from a specific segment that actually matters to me to make sure that my efforts are targeted? Because just because 5 random people at Starbucks enjoyed your click dummy prototype does not mean that it's actually usable for your target audience. And I've done that. So when we come from this angle and we go back to analytical, right? They have this obvious uncertainty we covered before. Like, what are the problems we can solve better? And a lot of teams I meet are then eager to jump into techniques, like schedule design sprint, let's do the jobs interviews, and all the good stuff, all the good techniques. But again, they are sometimes misguided. And what I encourage teams to do instead is to take a step back and think about, what do I actually need to learn? What do I actually need to learn from a more tactical perspective to really figure out what could help me improve the strategy? And the team at Analytical might land at a few research questions. What are the actual frustrations of agency customers right now? What type of different agencies exist? What kind of frustrations do they have in the different segments that are a part of? What kind of other tools are they using? For what reason? What are they doing in other tools that are not doing with our solution? How do they feel about them? What is the issue with these? Or maybe they also think about, maybe it's not just about the agencies. Maybe it's also about their clients, because they might use our product as well. They might interact with our product as well. So some of these, and more details, but these could be the actual questions the analytical team should have a clear idea of before thinking about which technique to actually use to avoid opportunistic discovery. And the issue is, of course, whenever you get started, particularly on the qualitative path of your work, there's always this one person who tells you, look, we want to be data-driven, so you did these interviews. Where's the statistical significance? Has anybody had that moment? I feel you. There's always this person, right? And of course, it's easy to rant about this person, to complain about them. But I recently found that just framing discovery success, or the stage you want to get to with discovery, a bit differently. And that's inspired by Ravi Mehta, who has this great quote that says, look, when it comes to product discovery decisions, it's not about statistical significance. It really is not. It might be for individual tactics. You don't want to make a prediction based on an inconclusive A/B test. But overall, the only question you need to answer is, what data do I need to get closer to informed conviction? And one of the most predictable follow-up questions I get from teams is, which score does informed conviction have, Tim? Like, there is no score. You can't score your way to informed conviction. It's this state you have to get to as a product manager, as a product team, where you really can stand in for whatever decision you need to make in your discovery, continuing, discarding an idea, continuing to pursue it. And it will always be this weird mix. It will always be this weird mix that informed conviction is actually made up of quantitative data, qualitative data, not always to equal parts, right? Whatever your context allows you to do. And it will always contain this mystical, magic, fairy dust ingredient of discovery decisions that is just called gut feeling. That will always be there to a certain degree. Yes, as little as possible, but again, what is better? Trying to iterate a discovery for 6 months with very limited data sets, or making a call earlier on with just enough informed conviction in the state you're in? So what does that mean for analytical? You know, they establish their research questions. They have this understanding of, okay, we need to get to informed conviction. So what did they learn? So I didn't sit next to them, but let's just imagine what they understood. So maybe they realized there's a proven problem from the different techniques and methods we used, which tells us that for agencies to aggregate data and tooling, it's a big pain, because they have to juggle all these different client data sources, and unifying them and creating a single source of truth is very, very difficult for them. Maybe that's a proven problem. Maybe they also know that, you know what, all the other competitors and the different solutions agencies use, they don't really allow for collaboration with clients. You always need to do back and forth of emails and going this way and that way. So maybe that's a proven pain for the agencies they want to serve as well. Maybe another third problem statement popped up, which is that agency clients, they want personalized dashboards and reports they can show to their clients, to the stakeholders internally right away. So they need a high degree of personalization. So they just landed on these 3 problem statements. And with these problem statements in mind and at hand, they can now start to reshape some of the other practices and decision-making we talked about. Because now, maybe when they go back to their problems, to their strategy, maybe they could sharpen it. It's probably not perfect. It's probably not proven as well. But maybe they can now say, look, the actual strategy is, yes, we want to grow revenue from analytics agencies. We want to become their go-to solutions, and we're going to focus particularly on agencies with more than 10 clients. So we narrow our playing field even further. And we want to make sure that we are the go-to solution for those agencies who want to create a single source of truth. And we're going to do that. We're going to try to do that by allowing the storing of not just our tracking data, but also third-party tracking data. That's the path we land on. And we plan on differentiating from existing solutions out there that we know exist, that we know are being used, by allowing for deeper customization, which is something a lot of agency clients seem to crave for, and we want to allow for real-time collaboration. Again, this is only the tip of the iceberg for any strategy work, right? This is just a very small synthesis, but at least it should make you more decisive. It should be more decisive. It should allow you to say no to things. Because when you now have some conversations like that, like we should make the free features worse, you can just tell Gary to go home. That has nothing to do with what we're trying to do here, because you now have something that it might not be right, but it might be an objectified decision-making point. And for those actual feature suggestions of, we have to follow on our own tracking data, you're like, that's literally the opposite of what we found out. We should definitely not pursue that. So it gives you, hopefully, a better idea of what to say yes and no to. Remember, which is one of the core values of where we want product strategy to be. So with this idea of that your product discovery is more targeted and you use whatever imperfect starting point you have in your product strategy, it just should allow to make your strategy more decisive. And this decisiveness does just not come from another template, another round of internal workshops, or just reading another article on how to do strategy. It's about doing the work that tackles the biggest uncertainties in your strategy. Now, here's the thing. You made a good strategy choice, you have a clear idea, but after all, you're doing strategy to help people say yes and no to things. And that means that they have to do tactical work from a discovery and delivery bit. And so you have the strategy choice, but then people who actually need to make the day-to-day decisions, they still might struggle with this void of disorientation. Like, what does that mean? And here's how a lot of companies approach this. They're like, okay, you ask for guiding, bring me more revenue. Who has said that before? Who has gotten a revenue goal for more orientation? Okay, some of you. So, the thing is that I don't believe that this is a viable solution, right? And I don't believe that this is a viable solution because it basically fails one of my favorite tests for looking at how useful a goal or metric for a team actually is. And for that, I'd like to borrow from another great thinker. And because the thing is that if you just do that, you're basically just repurposing the existing, not useful type of metric and just try to paint them in a different picture. You're like, what do you mean revenue is not useful? It's our OKR, when it's still just a reactive, lagging KPI you just used on another dashboard the month before. It doesn't change. Like, just because you call something different doesn't make it more or less useful, right? So, as I mentioned, I want to borrow from another great thinker's concept to make that more tangible. Because when we look at OKRs in this context of how it can help us connect the dots and make real progress, one of the most common issues on the other hand, that I see when it comes to OKRs or metrics in general, is that teams have to work on metrics that really does not help them measure their progress, which again is what I believe one of the core pieces of value a practice like product OKRs should help you to do. Like OKRs should help product teams to measure their progress towards actual specific strategic priorities by responding to their decisions. Like that's what they should do for you. And that should dictate how you then execute OKRs. But that's the value we want to go back to. And so with that in place, one of the common issues that prevents teams from getting this value is that they get handed metrics that they can't influence. They can't influence these metrics. And that's one of the issues with a metric like revenue. And so if we take the great concept from William Detner, who really says, look, there are a couple of areas and zones that are relevant for teams when it comes to metrics. On the one hand, you might have your zone of control. And very often for product teams, there's actually very little you can actually control. Really 100% control. It might be how much time you spend on something, the quality of your work, maybe the features you produce. Maybe that's what you can actually control. What is more interesting is your sphere of influence. The things you might not control 100%, but where you can have a strong influence. And as much as many product teams like to think that they can control outcomes, they cannot. You cannot control how customers will behave. You can influence it with a great solution and great execution, but you can't control it. And then you have these metrics that are really just your area of contribution, like those big metrics management loves that are really everybody cares about, but where you as a product team can only contribute to, because they only change as a result of multiple product teams coming together, playing their role, playing their part. So it's important where your metrics fall on the spectrum, because that will determine the usefulness of your metrics. So let's go back to Analytico. If you would give the Analytico team an impact metric, like a metric from the area of contribution, like how much money they make from agencies, it's something they can contribute to, but it's not really within their sphere of influence, right? And so that is a bit missing here. So what could they do? Of course, they could complain that the metric is not influenceable, but I think there's something more useful, because they have something already at hand, because they have identified the customer problems. So they understand the influenceable behaviors of the target audience that was determined by their product strategy. So they know some kind of behavior changes we actually want to create for agencies, and people work in agencies, is to allow them to connect multiple client data sources in one place. That's an influenceable behavior. Or that we want to allow for real-time collaboration on the platform. Another influenceable behavior. Or to allow for personalization. So we know that these problems are real, we prioritize them, we made them a part of our strategy. And so when we now think about metrics, like why should we stay stuck with high-level metrics like revenue, when we can actually think about what are influenceable metrics, right? And I think there's a lot of talk always about outcomes and focus on the outcomes for the users, when very often I think an outcome is determined by the realness of the problem that you're trying to solve related to that. So if you have proven problems in place, it should be much easier to get to influenceable metrics. You could measure how much you influence the first behavior by measuring, okay, how many data sources are agencies actually storing in our tool? That could be a metric that would tell you that. Or you could establish a metric that tells you how much time you have saved from emails and conversations by allowing for collaboration. Or you should think about, well, how often are these personalized dashboards actually viewed and seen and used? Right? So you have influenceable metrics at your fingertips that you can use to break down this big area of contribution metric that says revenue. Because if you really think about the different time horizons and use cases of some of the relationships between strategy and metrics, is that you make a product strategy choice, and it might be 6 to 18 months time horizon, and your time horizon will vary, and it will depend on the maturity of your company and your product. But in Analytico's case, they want to make sure that they grow agency revenue through openness and customization. In a nutshell, that's what the strategic path they've chosen. If you break that down further and you think about which metric tells us that this strategy has worked, you would land on, well, it's easy, right? It's like how much additional revenue did we make from agency clients? Like that's the ultimate but lagging indicator if what we're doing had the right impact on the business that we're trying to achieve. Right? So that's what you have here. But the issue is that this is a metric that's probably better suited for company OKRs or an annual OKR, because it's probably very slow, it's very lagging, it doesn't change that often. So what you need to then do is, okay, which influenceable behaviors will I turn into metrics that tell me if I'm moving in the right way? So we want metrics that are ideally way more leading and that are able to give the product team weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly feedback on if they're on the right track. And for example, we could use some of those influenceable metrics we derived from the measurable behaviors by thinking about, did people actually connect many data sources to their client projects? And that's what makes this then way more useful for the team to figure out if they are actually moving in the right direction towards the strategy based on the previous evidence they have collected from the strategy and the discovery work. Because if we bring this together, and again, I said in the beginning, I like to connect those dots instead of being a little bit too obsessed with the individual practices, the isolated practices. If you think about that, product strategy should really help you to say, what will we say no to as a high-level synthesis and simplified idea of what it should do? And that metrics really should help us to figure out, are we making progress to that thing that we wanted to say yes or no to? Like, does that allow us to measure progress as a team? And that then product discovery should come in and should also tell us, okay, why should we solve this problem over another? In terms of, does it help us move closer? Does it help us measure the progress in the light of the strategic priority we have established? And I think these three distinct questions reinforce each other quite a lot. And I think sometimes when you're stuck with one of these questions, looking at some of these adjacent practices like discovery, OKRs, or strategy, can actually be the path out of the rut you might be in when you think about, how do I improve my strategy? Because I think the intersection of these is actually what determines, from my perspective, the real progress bit. And so if I would have to oversimplify and break it down, I think real progress is about that you're solving the right customer problems, right? Easier said than done. And you measure the solving of the right customer problems in a way that drives prioritized business goals and not just, again, any customer problem. And ideally, you decide which problem to solve or not through evidence to make that an evidence-informed decision. Don't really like the word evidence-driven, by also thinking about, hey, is the practice we're doing right now, is it even valuable? Like, what are we doing the 10th design sprint this quarter? Like, does that help us with the value it needs to bring us for a given uncertainty from a strategic context? And I think if you bring these things together, it should make it more clear, like, if you're actually on the better path to making real progress, or if you're a bit too stuck with what I introduced earlier as alibi progress, by being a little bit too focused on, am I doing the thing correctly? Did I do the right method? Do I combine these correctly? But of course, the question is, when you leave from this conference, from this talk, you watch the other great talks that are still coming today, like, what can you do? Like, what are some of the things you can actually do as one of the next bits? And here's what I think you can do, what is very much within your sphere of influence. I think the first thing you can do, it's maybe tomorrow, it's maybe on Monday, you can look at whatever is presented in your company as product strategy and think about, where does it fall short? Use something like Roger Martin's stupidity test and think about, is the opposite of our strategy actually stupid on its face? And if it is, why? Which part of our strategy is so obvious and doesn't really help us make a real choice? I think all of you are probably able to spot that gap, to spot that uncertainty. From then on, you can think about, okay, what would I need to do to get closer to informed conviction? What would make me more informed and more convicted that a certain part of where to take our strategy is actually a good idea? What could you do? Which method, which technique? It does not mean you need to schedule 6 months of discovery workshops, but think about what is 1 or 2 activities that I could do. And when you have that, it should be easier for you to find metrics you can actually influence. Remember, we're not trying to directly measure our work through revenue, but metrics that we can influence that will contribute and lead to an increase in revenue, for example, in the long run. And again, I think most of these activities are within your sphere of influence. And it doesn't really matter where you start. But this could be one starting point for you to get going. And to make that starting point even easier, here's where you can get essentially the extended version of all the slides I just showed you today. You can check them out, revisit them, read them again, distribute them. And my sincere hope is that they help you to spot and stop alibi progress the next time you're trying to be too obsessed about the correctness of your way of working, that they help you to get a bit unstuck and that you really get reminded of maybe the path to getting clearer on product strategy might not be to do more product strategy, or to get better on OKRs is not to trying to write more or better OKRs, but to look at these other practices that influence these parts of your work so much. Thank you so much for your attention. I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. Tim, you were right on time. 5 minutes for Q&A, that's perfect. So
Perfect.
we have 5 minutes for Q&A. So who has a question for Tim? No one yet? Oh, there is one. You could take the mic there. That would be great. Please tell us your name and probably the company you're from.
Okay. Hi, I'm Matthias. I'm product coach at Codecentric. Thank you very much. I have a question. When you have these OKRs and you have leading OKRs, and you assume that there is a correlation or causality to company OKRs, how do you ensure that in the process?
Yeah. So my experience is that very rarely can you prove actual causation. I think that's wishful thinking. There might be companies where you have a perfectly orchestrated data science, 100% intelligence kind of stuff where you can prove causation. I think most of the time it's correlation. One of the most helpful practices I use with teams is, as simple as it sounds, is trying to build metrics trees. Like to take one of those lagging metrics at the top and try to break it down into its individual drivers. I think there are two ways to do that. One could be the algorithmic way, where you ideally plug in all your data sources into a tool like Double Loop, for example, and that populates it automatically. Frankly, very little companies have that luxury, so it's more about narrative-driven metrics trees. So I think it's more about leaning into the domain knowledge of the people you work with, and like, which metric do you think drives this one, et cetera, and break that down. Because I think if you use that and then you present your OKRs, it's to, let's say, management. I think it's more about, again, your narrative. Like, we strongly believe that focusing on this metric, we can influence, and we believe it links up for 2 or 3 levels to the company revenue. And then it's more a question of, do we all believe that together and can take that bet, so to speak.
Okay, so you would use common sense and see if it matches. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Would you say this is responsibility of the product team, or is it the leadership who does that, or which function?
I think it's two-sided. I think on the one hand, it is a leadership's responsibility to acknowledge that it does not make sense to measure a team's progress through company metrics like revenue. I think that has to be communicated. It has to be communicated that there's an expectation from management towards the teams. You can bring more leading indicators, but it's your challenge to point out how do they relate. Like, you have to bring the narrative. The actual doing, I think, is the team's responsibility, because only the team actually has the domain knowledge to figure out the drivers. Management typically can't do that.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you very much, Tim.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So we have more time for a question. So if there is no question, I would have one last question for you, Tim. And when I see your bullets there, product strategy, product OKRs, product discovery, so where is AI in there? So I don't see it.
Yeah.
What do you see?
I think it's everywhere. It's the easy answer. Like, the way I see AI right now in these domains is that it's probably an enhancer of all of these 3 practices, right? It can enhance you on your path to a better product strategy. It can enhance you by sparking creativity for writing objectives and maybe getting ideas for key results when getting the right context. It can help you synthesize discovery insights and get to those problem statements faster. And of course, if it's, my personal take is that if AI is part of your product, I think it's important to acknowledge that which part of AI is part of your actual strategy, because I think, as we have seen over the last couple of years, or months maybe, that just AI as a feature is not a good differentiator. You can't differentiate on having AI or a model. So I think it's more about thinking it in your strategy. How does it reinforce these other bits I'm already good at? So for me, it's about enhancing either what you're currently good at and these practices that lead to strategy, OKRs, and discovery.
But would you say that it somehow fundamentally changes the job as a product manager? Or
I'm not sure if I would use the word fundamentally, because right now it feels to me it's more like speeding up everything that you would do already. You just need less time to do it because you get a super booster on it. But I think the general critical thinking of doing that is still something you have to do, from my perspective. So I think it's not fundamental, but it's speeding things up, I would say, dramatically.
Okay, thank you very much. So big applause for Tim Herbig. Thank you, Tim.